Let me introduce you first, John.
Okay.
Okay, folks, what we're trying to do here, at least once a month, maybe more often, is bring you a scientific or mathematic or engineering type presentation. So last time we talked about space, rockets. This time we're going to talk about ships, the Navy. This is a former naval commander of a submarine, so he sailed underneath the sea for the United States Navy for years. And so, but he's going to talk about ships, all types of ships. And then the next presentation we have a guy coming from NASA that's going to talk about the mirrors that they use in space, optical mirrors. And he's going to be doing a presentation maybe in the next 2 or 3 weeks as well. So give him your undivided attention. I'd like you to just be quiet as much as possible for the next 15, 20 minutes. After that, you can open up and he'll ask questions, okay? But be able to pay attention, and then he's giving you a handout. So this stuff you can take, I was telling the gentleman earlier, this is the type of material you can take and use for your science projects in school. You know, you just pay a little bit of attention, then they say, let's do a science project in school. This will be stuff that nobody else will have, by the way, most likely. Okay, John Toma.
And I'll carry my introduction a little bit further. I did graduate from the Naval Academy back in 1972, and then I spent 6.5 years on nuclear submarines, primarily in the engineering department. I chose at that point to get out of the Navy, but I joined a civil agency, a federal agency out of Washington, D.C. It's the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, who regulates all civilian use of radioactive material in the United States. And I worked for them for 30 years. I've gone through my presentation, and I shouldn't say anything that confuses you, but if I say something that confuses you, please raise your hand. I'll acknowledge it and say what confuses you, and I'll try to get it straight. You've got a 15-page document in front of you. I'm going to go through all 15 of those pages. So it may take a little bit more than 20 minutes to get through it. The first page is talking about a quiz page. I'm not really wanting you to answer those questions out loud. I want you to think about those questions. I will answer each of those questions in turn in my presentation, so you'll know what the answer is. I can tell you that of the 3 questions, 2 of them only have one right answer. And one of them, I'll call it subjective. I'll have my opinion, you can have your opinion, and that's fine. But the 3 questions, the first one is very simple. What is a ship? A short definition of it. The second one, what is the title of the specific person in charge of the ship? And that's a title. Now, the third does not appear to relate to large ships, but it does, and I'm going to discuss why it relates to large ships. The reason why I said it doesn't appear to starts off by saying the Empire State Building is located in New York City and is roughly 1,451 feet tall. Now that's a big number, but most of you probably don't have a perspective of how big of a number that is. So I'm going to give you a reference value to use for that number. Now I have a question. How many of you have ever seen a football field? Okay. How long is a football field? A football field, you can put your hands down. A football field is 100 yards long. A yard is 3 feet, so basically it's 300 feet long. So if I tell you I've got a building, I've got a ship as big as a football field, that's a large ship under any definition that you're going to come to. Now, if you look at it, the Empire State Building, if I changed it to football fields, it's almost 5 football fields high. So now imagine that 100 yards that you can visualize in your mind, 5 times of that amount going up, straight up in the sky. That is a very large number. Currently, the largest operating ship in the world, it's not a United States ship, it's the Marisk, which is 1,302 feet long. That's a little over 4 1/4 football fields high. So the question I have for you is, do you think in the next 5 years there's gonna be a ship that's bigger than the Empire State Building is currently tall. Now, I'd like to say, I said my presentation was on large ship. There are no formal designations of large ships. You will find later on when we get to the first question that anything that can survive in the ocean is considered a large ship. But in simplistic terms, and I'll go ahead and finish that first question. A ship is a very large boat that can safely travel in the oceans. Vessels classified as ships cannot travel far up rivers when you have rivers like the Mississippi River hitting the Gulf of Mexico, because the rivers are too shallow for them to go up. Now, what they're going to have to contend with when they get out at sea, there's all kinds of variables out here. There's extreme high winds, in case you get caught in a hurricane. There's uncharted obstacles. We don't know the ocean floor as well as we know our own continent that we drive around our cars in. There are actually hidden mountains under there that aren't charted, that ships have ran into or submarines have ran into. There's underground volcanoes, in the water volcanoes, extreme cold and extreme heat. The ocean can be traveled safely with a properly constructed ship and a highly trained professional crew. Now, there are many different types of ships that float in the ocean. And like I said, my presentation is going to be on very large ships. Some of the ships that I talk about will be 300 yards, 3 times the football field in length. A few are even over 400 yards. And I'm going to discuss multiple classes of ships. Now, a class of ship means a standardized design. So all the ships in a single class are made to look alike, they just have different names. The military makes most of those ships that falls in classes. Although there are some cruise liners that are starting to say, why don't we use a standardized design for a cruise ship? But before we get into all of that, let's talk about some of the language used on a ship. For example, if we were on a ship and I turned to you and said, go aft on the port side till you get to the third ladder, go down the ladder, 2 decks, take the starboard side, going outboard and look for room 101. You probably would have no idea to find that room. Well, I'm going to talk about some of the nomenclature, so turn to page 2 of your handout, second page of the handout. You see a picture of a ship there. And there's one end that simplistically is called the pointy end by some people, but that's not its real name. And if you follow that back to the back of the ship, there's a flat end back at the back of the ship that's wider than the front. That pointy end is where the ship is going forward. And its real name is the bow.
She accidentally broke her paper.
That's okay. They're still in order. They're still there in order. You can take a look at it. It's just a staple cleanout. And you need to know that when people talk about the bow of the ship, they're talking about the front of the ship. Now, what do you think they call the back of the ship? Anybody ever heard of the stern?
I have.
Okay, and that's what the back of the ship is called. So that's the one where that flat end all the way at the back is called the stern. Now, that deck that runs the full length where you can see everything on is typically called the main deck. Now, ships have sides. They got right sides and left sides. But they don't call them right and left. They call them port and starboard. Anybody know if port or starboard is left or right? Well, which is it?
I think port is right and starboard is left.
No, and I'm going to tell you in a minute how you would know what it is, because it's very simple. Port has 4 letters in it, P-O-R-T. Left has 4 letters in it, L-E-F-T. Port and left are the same thing. Starboard on your right is just the one that's left over, because if it's not port, it's gotta be starboard. So, and that's looking forward to the bow, because you can't turn around and say, okay, I'll use my right hand, and I'm still pointing the right direction. You gotta be looking forward to have that happen. We've already, if I tell you to walk forward, where am I telling you to walk towards? The bow. If I tell you to walk aft, I'm telling you to walk towards the stern or the rear of the boat. They call, although if you look at something like the aircraft carrier, they have stairs that are actually stairs, but they call the things you go up and down on ships ladders, and it goes back to the sailing days, because back then they were ladders. And on a submarine, many times they are ladders that you're crawling up and down to go from one space to the next. And I'll leave out those last two. Now, I'm going to give you one more bit of trivia. You've probably heard some naval personnel, when they're being addressed either by a senior person, whether it's an officer being addressed by a senior officer, or an enlisted addressed by a senior enlisted, or any enlisted being addressed by an officer. When they're done, the person will look at them and say, aye, aye, sir. The Navy's the only group that does that. Everybody else is yes, sir, or no, sir. The Navy does aye, aye, sir. Aye, aye, sir has three different meanings that apply simultaneously. The first meaning is, I heard what you said. Second meaning is, I know exactly what you want me to do, and I have no questions. And the third meaning is, I will carry it out to the best of my ability to meet what you're doing. So when somebody says, aye, they're actually promising superior performance. Now, turn to page 3.
The Navy still say aye?
Yes. It's tradition, they always have. You don't hear it a lot because generally they're doing it on the ship or at the location where they're working. Page 3 shows a typical layout of the decks. The decks are like floors on a ship. The top deck that runs the full length is generally called the main deck. However, on an aircraft carrier, it's known as the flight deck because that's where flight operations are. You will notice that the engine room is at the bottom, the very last of the decks. The engine room is a very heavy room, and you want to put it as low on the ship as possible to give the ship stability. If you put it up too high, it can actually flip the ship over if you have a bad way of hitting the side. Now, yes? Okay, now, if you go to page 4, we're going to look at a cruise ship. This is a commercial ship. And a commercial ship means it's not a military ship. They come in different sizes and different colors. They will typically have about 1,000 passengers.
Hey folks, keep it down while he's talking, okay?
They typically have about 1,000 people on board, although there are some cruise ships that can hold up to 2,000 people. They typically go on short trips, 5 to 21 days out in the ocean, but they can't go longer. I was on a cruise ship once. I found it very comfortable, but my wife, who went along with me, didn't like the rocking of the boat. Because the boat continuously rocked back and forth. Now go to page 5. These are some of the biggest ships that you will see floating on the surface of the oceans. And they're all oil tankers. They'll either be 300 or 3 football fields long or 4 football fields long, depending on how much oil they're transporting. Now, if they have an accident, they can cause significant environmental damage because that oil, once it hits the surface, will float on the surface and actually go all the way across the ocean and contaminate shores that are 1,000 miles away. So it's something that environmentally you have to be very careful that you don't let happen. And they're still the most economical transport for oil in the world. And go to page 6. This is a container ship. And what they have on this container, and actually it's a standardized container ship, which is what everybody wants to go to. They have set boxes. Now, those boxes look real small because that picture is taken from a distance. If you were to walk up to it, they would be above my hand as I'm holding it up like this, and longer this way, but they're all the same size. So what they do is they fill those boxes, they weigh them, and then they tell where they're gonna put it on the deck. But because everything is the same size, all the containers they gotta hold, it's a lot cheaper. They don't have to have 3 or 4 different vehicles to drive different size things around. They can use the one vehicle. Those containers are used for almost all shipping from the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States. Now we'll get into some military aircraft. Page 7. This is an aircraft carrier, specifically the USS Kitty Hawk. The length of the aircraft carriers, the main deck and the flight deck, can be 300 yards or longer, 900 feet or longer in length. Yeah.
Why would they call it an aircraft?
Let me finish that. You'll go why in a few minutes. Because they have aircraft that can land on the ship and be stowed below decks. They have aircraft that are permanently assigned to the ship. And a lot of times they're offering, in a wartime environment, the aircraft are flying to shore to do the fighting, and then they come back to the ship. They have to be specially built to be an aircraft carrier. So do the aircraft, and in my opinion, so do the men who fly the aircraft. Because it's how they take off. That, if you think about it, if any of you have ever flown on an airplane, it has to run a good little ways down the runway before it takes off. 900 feet is not a good little ways down the runway for these things as heavy as they are. And we'll get to a diagram in a few minutes, and I'll explain how they take off and land. And what they do with the aircraft, they actually have elevators that they can drive the aircraft over to, and the elevator will take them down to the next floor to be stored. The largest U.S. aircraft carrier in service today is USS Nimitz class. It's 1,092 feet long. It has a little over 3.5 football fields long. Now there was another ship, USS Enterprise. Now this is the real ship. This is Enterprise, not the one you see on Star Trek when they play it on the TV shows. This one was our only nuclear-powered submarine. Our nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. And it operated for a long, long time before they decided to shut it down. And they shut it down because foreign ports didn't want a nuclear ship to come into the port, so it couldn't come into ports anymore. But during the Vietnam War, there were as many as 5,000 people assigned to the Enterprise at one time. Basically, it was a floating city. Page 8 is another aircraft carrier, or is not an aircraft carrier, it's a picture of an aircraft carrier. And this is where I wanted to talk to you about. If you look at the front, you'll see 4 lines marked catapults. 1, 2, 3, and 4 up at the top of the page. Those are steam catapults. And the way that they get the aircraft to go up in the air, they hook by a blocking system the catapult behind the airplane to a place that it can push on. And then they give a powerful blast of steam to the backup. And it's enough to send the aircraft forward very rapidly. At the same time they do that, the pilot pulls the throttle back on his jets to get them to go off. And the plane, in a very short distance, will be up in the air and take off. I've watched some of those sometimes, and it can get scary because what happens sometimes is a plane will go off the end of the aircraft and will disappear below your line of sight, so you think it's going to hit the sea and sink. And then the jets will kick in and it'll come up and fly away. It's an interesting thing to watch, but very dangerous.
I saw that on one of my video games that I played before. It was like he was in like a little seat, and they were like ready, and they put their guns up, and he just like went off flying like really fast.
Now I want to tell you that doing that not only puts a tremendous stress on the airplane, the pilot that's sitting in there is slammed to the back of the seat. And so it hurts